Setting the stage over the next 45 minutes, we have 4 very impressive speakers who will share with us their vision for a better oceans economy, a more integrated oceans economy, and a more inclusive oceans future. Our first speaker for setting the stage is Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Member Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, and someone who is deeply invested in this particular domain, from stitching ships to sailing in those stitched ships. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal is going to be at sea very shortly, but today he's going to talk to us about economic ideas and policies and approaches that can help us re-engage with the sector. May I request everyone to remain seated, and we are beginning this particular segment. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, may I request you to come on stage.
Honorable Minister Sonowal, Honorable Mr. Thakur, Your Excellencies from across the world, ladies and gentlemen, today is in many ways a major turning point in our maritime history. And let me explain. You see, India is one of those countries which has a very impressive and long maritime history. Very often when you hear about maritime culture and ancient maritime culture, the Phoenicians come to your mind. But in fact, Indians were sailing the oceans 1,000 or more years before the Phoenicians. So if you look back to our history, going back to the Bronze Age, we had Indian merchants sailing all the way through to Mesopotamia in 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Indeed, we are the only country in the world which actually has an ocean named after us, the Indian Ocean. So we're not new to the oceans, and yet in the last 75 odd years, we have slowly slipped behind in a sort of way. So despite this very long and impressive maritime history, today India, at the cusp of becoming the world's 3rd largest economy, in fact in PPP terms already the world's 3rd largest economy, is in the awkward position where we really have only 1,500 odd large ships. 1.4 billion people are served by only 500 odd overseas ships that trade with the rest of the world. So an economy which is already 8% of the world economy, 16% of the world's population is served by only 1.2% carrying capacity in terms of Indian-owned ships. In some ways, this is the opposite of what it is for Greece, as we just heard. Indian flagships are only 0.77% of the world. So really, we are not punching our own weight as far as shipbuilding and ship flagged and ship owned by Indians is concerned. Indeed, China is currently building something like 47% of the world's ships, South Korea 29%, and Japan 17%. In India, less than 1%. 95% of India's merchandise trade is carried by foreign ships, as a result of which we spend about $90 billion around about this year in terms of freight and other charges. So this is an economic cost, and of course, it is a geostrategic risk. So this is something we need to think about as a country, as an economy, at multiple levels, and therefore, we thought that we need to give up our landlocked view of the world and re-embrace the oceans that we have had such a long link with. So in some ways, I'm very glad that as the first step towards breaking away from this landlocked approach to the world, we have taken on the first step in terms of the Sagarmanthan, the Great Oceans Dialogue, as a way of breaking ourselves out of this landlocked view of the world. So what are we going to do about this? And let me say that this government is fully committed in changing our shipping and ship-related infrastructure very radically over the next decade. And this is why we are here. Now, India, ironically, for its very small footprint in the shipping world, ironically has a huge amount of capabilities. Not only do we have a long coastline, we actually have a great deal of shipbuilding capability. We are one of the few countries in the world which can actually build nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers. We make our own steel. We have young people. Indeed, we already contribute some 20% of the world's sailors. So it's not like we are not capable of doing all of this. We do. But we need to change policy in a fundamental way in order to be able to take on the shipping world. And to do this, let me say, and you heard this from the Honorable Minister as well before this, we are going to change all the relevant laws and policies. The amount of finance that shipping needs a complete overhaul in the way we think about ships, for example. Let me say that in the next few months, we will move to provide ships with infrastructure status so that they can get long-term financing, 20, 30 years of cheap financing. We will change the SARFAESI Act, which is so that you can sell collateral, so that ships can be treated as collateral. Today, for a variety of historical reasons, we don't allow banks to treat ships as collateral. Now, how on earth do we expect long-term financing if you do not allow that? So the SARFAESI Act has to be changed. Similarly, let me say that we are going to make all the relevant changes needed in our laws for flagging, ownership and all that, so that we can, one by one, get rid of all the hurdles and blockages there are for Indian flagging and Indian ownership, and of course for shipbuilding right here in India. The idea is that over the next decade or so, we will change the ship and ship-related landscape completely. So for example, we intend that in the next decade or so, we will have something between 10 to 12% of the world's shipbuilding done here in India. As I already told you, we have the shipbuilding skills. We are one of the few countries that actually can build aircraft carriers and nuclear subs. Surely we can build tankers and ship containers. We have the steel and we have the demographics. I mean, at the end of the day, shipbuilding is a young person's business. So we have the demographics to do it too. Similarly, we intend that the ship ownership and ship flagging should be somewhat commensurate to our share in the world economy, somewhere in the 8 to 10% range, which we will have over the next decade or so. These are ambitious targets, but as I said, we are very determined to do this. If nothing else, our own economy and our own requirements will create a market for this shipping capability. So let me say that a decade from now, when we are doing Sagarmanthan in November of 2034, we will want those targets. And let me repeat them once more. We would like to be somewhere between 10 to 12% of the world's shipbuilding and somewhere in the 8 to 10% range as far as ship ownership and flagging is concerned. This, I know, is very, very ambitious for a country that is not even doing 1% today. But as I said, 20 years ago, China was a non-player in the shipbuilding industry. So, in many ways, being a large economy and a rapidly industrializing one, we need this as an important engine of our industrializing policy. So let me end by saying that we are very serious about this. And of course, there are many other things that come with shipbuilding. We are working towards that as well. The ports in particular. And you already heard that we are dramatically going to expand our ports. In fact, we have recently announced that we are going to build a port just north of Mumbai, in Vadhavan. The idea is to be able to build this, which will, by the way, be the largest by far port we have ever attempted to build. The idea is to have it built by 2030, but I'm being assured by Umesh Vagji, who is the chairman of Jawaharlal Nehru port authority, but also the person in charge of building this port, he assured me that this port will be ready by 2028. And that this port alone will reduce the cost of shipping for northern India, northern and western India by 25%. So we are seriously playing on this space. And as I said, we're going to put our best foot forward on this. So watch out for us. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Sanjeev. We have the first quotable tweet from this conference, 10% in 10 years. I think that's the number we need to chase, both in terms of shipbuilding as well as flagging and ownership. Certainly an ambitious target, but something it's time for India to chase. And to do that, we need partnerships. And let me invite one of India's most robust partners, a speaker from Norway, Signe Brudeset, Director General Regional Development, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Norway, to speak to us. They are already doing a lot of work with India in a number of spaces in this particular domain, including on shipbuilding. So, Madam, the mic is yours.
Dear friends, ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am extremely happy to be here today to join this first conference on Great Oceans Dialogue. And dear Dr. Saran and the team who have made this conference possible, I think you are answering the challenge that you got from your minister, Sonowal, on an excellent term. And so thank you to everyone in front of the stage and also behind organizing everything. So Norway, we are happy to be here and on board from the beginning. I am also very pleased to see that Norway is well represented here today, including from our vibrant businesses, innovation and research communities, as well as with our Ship Owners Association. This is a testament to the long-standing Norwegian-Indian participation and partnerships on ocean issues. Up to 5,000 Indian citizens are currently employed on Norwegian-owned ships. Indian shipyards are finding Norwegian partners for developing innovative and state-of-the-art vessels. And next year's entry into force of the Hong Kong Convention should also give increased rooms for business collaboration on ship recycling. Importantly, we have also worked closely together on maritime security. When we were last together on the United Nations Security Council, this included a strong India-led statement from the Council and a Norwegian-Ghana-led resolution on piracy in the Gulf of Guinea. This work took place in the cooperation also with then-member the United Arab Emirates, as well as strong regional leaders like Nigeria. We are glad to note that positive trends along the coast of West Africa in recent years. And I mentioned this as an example of initiatives that we can do together. Friends, on the backdrop of a challenging geopolitical situation, some Norwegian core priorities include to promote a global order based on international law and ensure compliance with the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, including freedom of navigation. It is also to promote maritime security, green shipping, digitalization, maritime competence, equality, the development of ports and fairways, and ensuring sustainable growth of the ocean industries. Meanwhile, we have also taken note of your very ambitious plans. In other words, there are lots of room for even more cooperation. In the coming years, we expect a rapid technological change in maritime sectors. Autonomous vessels will be developed. Artificial intelligence is entering. Shifts to new fuel will reduce emissions. The growth in offshore wind will require investments in support vessels, both for the construction and operating phases. Fisheries, aquaculture, processing and distribution of fish products are set to grow. To harvest the potential in these technologies and markets, the maritime industries will need to adapt to several challenges. Increased uncertainty concerning security and trade policy can impact where ships can sail safely and which markets our businesses have access to. Furthermore, the industry is facing an urgent need for manpower with the right and updated skills and knowledge. This regards maritime transport as well as shipyards and other industry. We need to ensure that our workers are competitive, relevant, and plentiful. And as I mentioned, many Indian citizens work on Norwegian ships, and we are very happy to have such competent workers on our ships. Coming from an ocean nation, I am glad to say that Norway is in an excellent position to meet these challenges and opportunities together with you. The Norwegian maritime industry is among the most competitive and advanced in the world. We are committed to shaping the future of the maritime industry, promoting excellence and sustainability on a global scale. With our respective technologies, competencies, and markets, actors from Norway, India, and other countries are very well placed to complement each other's going forward. Friends, let me leave you with 4 points that will be key to ensuring a stable basis for our cooperation across oceans. First, let me be clear. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea sets out the legal framework within which all activities in the oceans and seas must be carried out. Standing together to protect a global order at sea based on international law matters as much as ever. At this time, we should all be especially wary of attempts at creating gray zones and parallel shadow structures as challenges to our fundamental rules at sea. Among other dangers, this puts our seafarers, vessels, and environment at risk. We welcome closer dialogue with partners on how to jointly address this. Second, up to 90% of goods transported are transported on the oceans. Shipping needs to decarbonize to net zero as agreed by the International Maritime Organization. This transition can only be solved through stronger global partnerships. Partnerships between India, Norway, and others on governmental level, as well as commercial, have great opportunity to lead the global transition to net zero. Third, sustainable ocean management is key for our common future. Norway, India, and many others are working together on this towards a productive UN Ocean Conference in France next year. India and Norway have both signed the groundbreaking BBNJ agreement on conservation and sustainable use of the marine biological diversity. We encourage everyone to do so. Norway also hopes for an ambitious, legally binding instrument on plastics pollutions, including in the marine environment in Busan later this month. And of course, the oceans are a great reservoir for healthy and delicious seafood. Fourth and finally, we underline the importance of our oceans for cooperation and trade across regions and countries. The Indo-Pacific is an area of growing importance for global security and stability. We share a principal interest in the freedom of navigation, and we also have an interest in working together against hindrances and threats to trade routes, such as piracy and armed robbery at sea, as well as by other militants. We cannot allow armed actors to hold the free world and global trade hostage. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I am glad to note that these points correspond to the aspirations set out by India and others. This conference is a call for international cooperation, and this is what our discussion should be about these next few days. How do we best achieve it? I look forward to our future exchanges and learning from all of you. With this, I wish the conference all success. Thank you so much.
Let me now invite on stage Mr. John Kayode Fayemi, President, Forum of Regions of Africa. He's from Nigeria. John, may I request you to take the stage, please?
Thank you, Samir. Honorable Ministers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be part of the Sagarmanthan, the Great Ocean Dialogue here in Delhi. The Forum of Regions of Africa is a forum of subnational, sub-sovereign governments of states, provinces, regions, and it seeks to strengthen the capacity of subnationals as critical role players in the national development agenda. The subject of this dialogue is very important given the growing influence of the Global South in the emerging geoeconomic strides of the global development agenda. This is even more so as the world is grappling with supply chain disruptions, rising sea levels, climate change challenges, biodiversity decline, well-being of coastal communities, and poor ocean governance. A central imperative, therefore, is the development of a people-centered approach to tackle these challenges. And this cannot be successfully done on a global scale without taking into account the African dimension of the challenge. The African continent is endowed with massive aquatic and marine resources. The continent has 38 coastal states out of its 54 member nations, and a number of island states: Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Mauritius, Madagascar, Seychelles, and the Comoros Islands. Collectively, African coastal and island states coverage encompass vast ocean territories of 13 million square kilometers. Yet challenges abound. These include illegal fishing, leading to an estimated annual loss of $10 billion, and dumping of toxic waste. Sea piracy and illegal drug trafficking are also serious challenges. Given the criticality of the Indian Ocean to India and Africa, this dialogue is happening at an auspicious moment. Only 2 days ago, in Nigeria's capital, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his host, President Bola Tinubu, committed themselves to joint actions to secure maritime trade routes and control piracy in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Guinea. PM Modi further underscored the strategic importance of the Mediterranean Channel, the Gulf of Guinea, and the Mozambique Channel, all choke points in the Indian Ocean, towards deepening maritime partnership between India and Africa. Indeed, many observers in India have posited that if India is to maximize its great power potentialities, it can only look in the direction of the Indian Ocean. And to such commentators, this is why the Indian Ocean should be India's ocean. And from what we've heard from our ministers, it's clear that India is on its way to meeting that expectation. Equally for us in Africa, and in response to the growing importance of the blue economy that is already generating over $350 billion on an annual basis, and an estimated $600 billion by the year 2063, African states have also been spending considerable amount of time in developing Pan-African instruments, such as the policy framework and reform strategy for fisheries and aquaculture in Africa, the African Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050, the 2016 Lome Charter on Safety and Security of Oceans and Shipping, as well as promoting ocean-related issues in the Africa Agenda 2063, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and the Africa Mining Vision, and the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, particularly Agenda 14 and 6, and the Africa Blue Economy Strategy. These various instruments are focused on developing local knowledge and capacity to ensure the necessary paradigm shift amongst African countries on marine and aquatic biotechnology and ecosystem conservation, on environmental sustainability, climate change, and coastal infrastructure, on management of fishing activities in Africa's aquatic space, on development of sea, river, and lake transportation for the growth of an Africa-wide shipping industry, on exploitation and beneficiation of deep-sea mineral and other resources, and on strengthening governance institutions aimed at addressing the complexities associated with water bodies. In many African countries, experiencing increasing awareness on these issues has started happening, and the main drivers of change are inevitably the population dynamics and nutritional challenges, the regional and international economic integration issues, nationally determined contributions, environment and biodiversity protection, adaptation investments and mitigation dynamics, sustainable blue energy for addressing energy demand, ocean mining for meeting global demand and national economic development, and innovative industries for accelerating economic development benefits. I believe for the next steps, and also for India to achieve the maritime strategy that has been espoused, I think it's time for India to also work in partnership with African countries more collaboratively on establishing comprehensive assessment of Africa's blue economic potential, on maritime spatial planning, on maritime security strategy. And here, India has to make up its mind whether it wants to have a strongman navy, or a constabulary navy, or just a free-rider navy, which essentially is what has been happening. But from what the ministers have told us, it seems to me that India is now ready to take a much more direct and active role. And from what Prime Minister Modi said in Abuja, this seems to be the direction to go. And India would also do well in working on integrated approach to the development of marine ecosystems, and all of the above require collaborative efforts to guarantee partnerships for progress and to promote good governance and social impact, both in India and in Africa. I wish you a successful conference.
Thank you, John. And let me now invite Mr. Rizwan Sumar, CEO and Managing Director, Middle East, North Africa and the Indian Subcontinent, DP World, United Arab Emirates. And I must share with all of you that he has been most supportive of this effort to put together a global conference in a 90 days time frame. We reached out to Rizwan and we told him this is the challenge, and he says, where should I sign? And we want to make sure that we can put this together. So we are delighted that along with the government of Norway, we also have DP World, who joined us as the founding partners for this conference that we have put together. So ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you Rizwan Sumar. Rizwan.
Thanks, Amir, for those kind words. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. It's an honor and a privilege to address this gathering at this very, very important conference. I would like to thank the Observer Research Foundation to bring together such an inspiring group of leaders to discuss maritime trade and the importance in its economic growth. Today, as we come together to discuss the future of maritime trade, I want to emphasize a very crucial aspect of connecting emerging economies through multimodal corridors. The next phase of global growth will be led by these emerging economies, as we all know. And maritime and logistics will be a very, very key enabler. Trade is a backbone of global commerce, with almost 80% of global trade moving on seas. For emerging economies, those that are landlocked, access to global maritime trade is very crucial to serve both their domestic demand needs as well as to participate in global value chains. At DP World, we believe that connecting these emerging markets to the global maritime network is a social and an economic necessity. Countries across Africa, South and Central Asia, as well as Latin America, where rapidly growing populations are driving demand for goods and services, the role of multimodal trade corridors is irrefutable. Traditional trade corridors are already very concentrated, and we have heard many stories about a ship blocking the Suez Canal, throwing global trade in a complete disarray. The Malacca Strait, for example, is handling about 25% of global trade. The Suez Canal is handling about 12%, and the Panama Canal, 15% of the global trade. So this just proves the point that the concentration of global trade in these three corridors are essentially a big, big risk to the resilience of global trade. To connect emerging economies, therefore, to the global supply chains, we must build alternative multimodal trade corridors linking these countries to the rest of the world. The development of the right transportation infrastructure at the right location with the right capacity, therefore, becomes essential. The World Bank estimates that every dollar that is actually spent in transport infrastructure gives back $4 in terms of economic growth, which again proves the point that this investment is not just necessary, but absolutely critical. A couple of trade corridors that Mr. Sanyal also mentioned in his speech, the India-Middle East corridor, India-Middle East-Europe corridor, or the IMEC, and the INSTC, which is the International North-South Trade Corridor. These are the two trade corridors in focus, at least in this part of the world. And they are very key examples of multimodal trade corridors which have a tremendous potential to de-risk some of the more traditional trade corridors and therefore create resilience in global trade. Infrastructure for logistics and maritime trade remains a key challenge for these economies, the emerging economies in particular, because of their consumption-led demand. The growing middle class, for example, in these markets is projected to triple by 2030. This obviously will need the transportation infrastructure that can keep pace. And this represents, therefore, an unprecedented opportunity in maritime trade to become transformative for these economies. Increasing complexity of supply chains and the dynamic nature of demand in these markets needs to be addressed through adequate capacity. At ports, streamlined logistics, infrastructure, and processes that can actually respond to changes induced by geopolitical forces. For instance, the African ports handle 4% of the global trade, and they represent almost 17% of the global population. And in some instances, the border delays, for example, cost an average of 20% in terms of cost of goods sold. And many emerging markets do not have access, or direct access at least, to maritime trade, and therefore there is a need for transshipments and volume consolidation to get the goods exported from these countries or to be delivered to them. This essentially adds to inefficiency, because transshipment essentially means an extra handling, an extra cost, and therefore inefficiency that can actually be taken away if you have a direct ship that takes it from port A to port B, the cargo in question. So there are four pillars that I would like to talk to you about. The first is to create an integrated supply chain, which is critically important so that you're able to actually handle the handovers very effectively and efficiently. So by linking ports to the hinterland very effectively is very, very important. So you need a network of roads, railways, the last mile, first mile connectivity, all seamlessly integrating with ports, ports seamlessly integrating with other ports, and then, of course, the inland infrastructure at the other end to ensure that the end-to-end transportation is actually happening seamlessly. And it's also very important that the information that actually flows and the documentation that flows from the A to B is also essentially in pace with the cargo. So if documentation arrives earlier, it's not necessarily good, but if the cargo actually arrives earlier and the documentation has to wait, it's actually inefficient because the cargo has to wait for the right documentation to come in, as an example. Or if information is actually not available when it's needed to be available. So for example, if I don't know where my cargo is, and if there's a geopolitical force that essentially disrupts my supply chain, how am I actually going to plan B and C in order to make sure that my cargo reaches on time and my customer essentially is not suffering? The second is, of course, sustainability and resilience. This is critically important because, as the Honorable Minister also mentioned, ecology is very, very important as well, not just the economy. And so therefore, DP World has actually committed to net zero emissions by 2050. The important point about multimodalism is that it gives choices to clients. So you can actually choose the most sustainable form of transport. You can actually choose the most cheapest form of transport if your goods do not allow a high logistics cost. And you can choose the fastest mode of transport if that is what is needed in that sense. So multimodalism gives you choices. There's a direct correlation between moving cargo by coastal, rail, and road where carbon emissions is concerned. And sometimes there's a factor of 4 between coastal and road movement. And so therefore, multimodalism is essentially very, very important from a sustainability perspective as well. And the third pillar is digitization and the innovation per se, right? The adoption of electronic trade documentation to cut processing time, for example, the cost can come down by as much as 40% if you have electronic documentation that actually moves from A to B, just like the way the cargo would. An example of something that India and UAE has actually done, a program called Maitri, which is a virtual trade corridor, where the port community systems in India and the UAE would actually talk to each other. They would essentially ensure that customs is actually in the loop. And so therefore, there is faster clearance, there is anticipation in terms of what cargo would actually come in, and you're prepared for it. There is a process that will actually make sure that the cargo is actually cleared as fast as possible. And at least in terms of the need for data, that delay is actually taken off. And there are many more technologies that I can actually talk about in terms of innovation. So for example, there is a box bait technology that DP World has essentially patented, which can triple the capacity of the yard in the port. It can take away the non-productive moves by almost 60%. And this has a direct bearing on the cost of the project. It has a direct bearing in terms of the cost of logistics as a result. There are blockchain platforms that actually help in terms of building a trust-based system where information flow is seamless. There's another example that I can actually talk about, which is essentially about making trade flow between the emerging economies and between the emerging economies and mature markets. There is a lot of cost associated with currencies in that sense to settle dues, right? There are intermediaries, there's dependence on one currency, there's dependence on one system. If we can have options based on blockchain platforms that can actually do trade settlement instantaneously, taking out the intermediaries, taking out the banks, this would essentially bring the cost of logistics down and will actually help MSMEs and SMEs to actually participate in the global trade more effectively. The other factor is obviously international trade agreements. The CEPA, for example, that was signed between India and UAE resulted in almost a 16-17% increase the following year in terms of the trade between the two countries. So this will essentially also help to make sure there is more demand that is actually both recognized and delivered in that sense. So ladies and gentlemen, the maritime domain holds a key to more interconnected and prosperous world, but realizing this potential would need a very collaborative effort. The public sector must prioritize investments in infrastructure, create the enabling policy frameworks, for example. The private players must innovate, invest, build capacity where it is needed most. Technology providers must ensure that their solutions are accessible, affordable, and adaptable, and all adaptable to the unique challenges of the emerging markets. Our investments in infrastructure and technology and human capital must be guided with the belief that the trade should flow freely, just like the currency example that I gave you, where there are restrictions, for example, where emerging economies can't trade with each other simply because there's a restriction imposed on them by certain currencies, as an example. Together, let us unlock the full potential of maritime trade for the emerging economies. And by doing so, we will not only just transform the lives of millions of people, but also create a more resilient and inclusive global trade network. Thank you very much for your time.